This is about a recent paper published in Nature Communications. And the paper is named Discrepancy in Scientific Authority and Media Visibility of Climate Change Scientists and Contrarians by Peterson et al. And so this has been making the rounds, and it's viewed as sort of a blacklisting of people who don't toe the climate catastrophe line. And so what it essentially does is it compiles two lists of people. One of people who have some media influence and are also speakers at the Heartland Climate Conference, authors of the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change report, also published by the Heartland Institute, and people present on the DSMOG blog, which the authors regard as a long-standing effort to document climate disinformation efforts associated with numerous contrarian institutions and individual actors, but which is really sort of a database of people who are not in line with a catastrophic climate narrative and quite biased in its outlook on that. And so first, the good news is among these alleged contrarians and deniers, as the authors call these people, Alex makes the list in the first third of the list, which is ranked by media influence. So congratulations to Alex for having some influence on the debate. And the second list, they are comparing with the first one, is compiled of scientists who publicize in climate change related fields and are the most highly cited and also have some media visibility. So examples would be Michael Mann and Kevin Trenbers, which are household names to people following the climate debate in the mainstream media. And so they are comparing these two and their visibility, how often they are quoted and invited on media outlets and so on. And so the obvious narrative of this is, okay, so we have one list of people who don't have a lot of scientific credentials, but still have some media influence on the climate debate in the public realm. And then in juxtaposition to this, we have some super top scientists who are cited all the time in scientific papers, and they have a lot of authority, as the authors call this, in the field, but they are not heard remotely enough in comparison to their actual degrees and professional credentials. And so let me just give you a quote from the article. So their conclusion is that indeed communication scholars have noted that in the case of climate change, such disproportionate visibility or false balancing is likely to mislead public perception, suggesting falsely that within the scientific community, there's parity in the number of scientists who do and do not agree on the fundamental issues of anthropogenic climate change. So this is sort of their conclusion or finding, that there's a disproportionate amount of non-catastrophic narrative in the public eye. So this paper, in my professional judgment, is complete junk science, and I'll just give you a couple of points why that is. So first of all, they use vague terminology. So they don't define what a denier or contrarian is. They're sort of using these terms, implying that everyone knows what is meant. So they don't even have a qualitative definition of what would be a position of someone like Alex, who's in the contrarian list, and what is the actual position of someone like Michael Mann on the scientist list. Another thing is that they compare apples to oranges. So they make a list of publishing scientists in a rather obscure field. So this is not something very popular, with people who are media figures often. So this is like apples and oranges, or as Judith Curry, a climate scientist, said, comparing peanuts to elephants. And it's not really making two equal lists and then comparing the media visibility. So obviously someone like Greta Thunberg would be more visible than Kevin Trenberth, who is a climate scientist, but Greta Thunberg is not on the list of the pro-catastrophe list because she's not a scientist. So you're comparing two really different categories of people, and obviously the people who are sort of more on the communication side and more on the politics side are more often on media outlets. And they also make some kind of comparison in the mainstream media, but also in what they call new media, like blogs and podcasts and so on. So this obviously biases the outlook, because people who don't agree with the catastrophic climate narrative often show up on a greater number of podcasts that don't have a lot of reach. They don't have as much reach as CNN or Fox News, but they are counted as media appearances. And then they have a couple of miscounts. So hit job articles are counted as media mentions, which of course is not good publicity for the people who get hit by these attack articles. And some are misidentified as quote-unquote contrarians when they are actually established scientists and contributors to the IPCC reports. Some examples are Roger Pielke Jr., Roger Pielke Sr., Scott Denning, who's actually an alarmist type, but he ended up on the wrong side by this counting, probably because he spoke at the Heartland Conference against the majority of the people visiting the Heartland Conference. So it's not a really good methodology here. And then they, of course, use a citation metric of the scientist, like how often does your work get cited in other scientific work, which might or might not be a good measurement of the quality of your research. And of course, it's a false dichotomy overall. They say, well, there's one correct side and there's one wrong side, and there's no nuance in, people agreeing with the basic science of the IPCC and then disagreeing with what the policy prescription should be or what the impacts are, and so on and so forth. So overall it's a complete junk science paper to me.
Let me jump in about, you're calling it false dichotomy. So I come at it I come at the climate issue primarily from the perspective of, I have more expertise on energy than I do on climate. And the reason I'm commenting on the issue is because the issue of our influence on the climate is completely inextricably connected to the question of what sources of energy we use to power our civilization, or if we fail to use fossil fuels, it's failing to power our civilization, I believe. So just the whole question of what to do about rising CO2 levels is a completely interdisciplinary question that is hugely an energy question. And so energy is fundamental to our whole standard of living because it's the fuel of all of the machines that allow us to live in this unprecedented way, and also experiencing unprecedented progress, which has really just been 200 years or so that we've had this rate of progress and this progress of human flourishing. So it's just from a human perspective, it's just so obvious that you need to be eminently concerned with all of the questions about how cheap, plentiful, reliable, versatile will energy be in the world. And some of the people on the list are people whose expertise is in energy. And they're saying, yeah, I don't think that the negative side effects of rising CO2 levels are anywhere near as significant as the negative impacts of making energy more expensive, scarce, unreliable, less versatile. So there's just no acknowledgement on this issue that energy is really important and that expertise in energy is very relevant. And I think I would like to see a real study done on the issue of renewable energy and to see how much distortion there is of people who are remotely fact-based versus people who are just making wild speculation. You would think it would kind of be the equivalent of if you had people just claiming, oh, I've got something better than silicon microchips, and silicon microchips that is the core technology for our whole computational system that we have. And so if you just had cranks saying all the time, oh, well, I can do it with this and I can do it with that, and I have some green semiconductor technology, you'd say, well, if you pay too much attention to those people, you're really going to distort the reality, which is that silicon microchips are the foundation of modern computation. And they've given us computation power on a scope and scale that was just completely unimaginable, and that's completely unrivaled. And the same is basically true for fossil fuels or hydrocarbon energy. So there's just no, I mean, I think not first and foremost for this whole thing, because there are a lot of distortions, but just recognizing that energy is such a value, and that expertise in that value is absolutely essential when considering the question of rising CO2 levels. Steffen,
Alex,
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I wanted to emphasize, and maybe Steffen, you were planning to get to it, but this is part of the press release. So the context is not that they just have this lousy report, but this is what Professor Peterson says. He says, and again, this is the press release that's going out promoting this article. It's time to stop giving these people visibility, which can be easily spun into false authority. By tracking the digital traces of specific individuals in vast troves of publicly available media data, we develop methods to hold people and media outlets accountable for their roles in the climate change denialism movement, which has given rise to climate change misinformation at scale. This is really an active effort to come up with a list that the media and others should use, not to promote people like you and like the other people on the list.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a very direct attack, and you can see with other things we've discussed that there is, among major media outlets, they're trying to develop policies that essentially, I mean, they think of it as how do we properly acknowledge the climate crisis or climate emergency, and then really how do we somehow get people to do the right thing from our perspective, which they just keep refusing to do. And so one thing is, The Guardian had it as, we're going to call it climate crisis or climate emergency, but you can see it as, yes, do not allow these people. And like, if you allow these deniers, these people were in a published paper, this was on the deniers list. And then as much authoritarianism as exists in this debate, that can be considered decisive. So it's really an attempt to, it's an attempt to suppress actual discussion. And you can see that in just the sloppiness of it. It's very much, we want our clique to be unopposed, not actually, we want to help people make certain distinctions, which, I could imagine a paper that sort of classified people in a certain way that was useful to people, but this is not that. Steffen, did you have any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I slightly disagree with the categorization as a blacklist, and many people have called it a blacklisting, but I think like the sloppy nature of how they sorted people into the different buckets, to me doesn't indicate a blacklisting of individuals, like sort of a list of people who shouldn't be invited, but it's more like the establishment of a narrative, like there's a correct narrative and everyone who falls out of this cannot be important enough to show up on media and actually needs to be suppressed. So I don't think it's a targeted list in that sense. But there's also an issue going on with this paper according, it's an alleged ethics violation going on, and it might be retracted because of that, because they gathered personal data from the people and publicized it with real names and not anonymizes, and this might be against the law, and I think it's published in the UK. And I wouldn't like to see that, because I think this paper is important. I think it should be accessible to the public with all of its content. And also the reactions by these alleged top scientists and their following should also be on display, because we need to see this for what it is, which is sort of a bullying tactic against people who don't toe the line And I think the vague language and sloppiness is very intentional, because you don't need to define what the actual correct position is, and you don't need to argue about that. You just say, well, there are legitimate and illegitimate voices, and we decide which one is legitimate. And so this is sort of the method employed here. And I think it should be transparent, it should be widely shared, and people should read it for themselves. It's written in plain English. And it should be in open daylight what's going on here.